The Supreme Court just delivered a historic blow to presidential power. A 50-year-old law has rewritten America's trade war overnight. Welcome to Tax Mistory.
Today, we are really diving into a Supreme Court decision that didn't just make headlines, it fundamentally redrew the lines of presidential power, sent shockwaves through the global economy, and, put a staggering $175 billion on the line. So yeah, let's get right into it. Okay, so this whole thing really kicks off with these incredibly powerful words from Chief Justice John Roberts. This is the phrase that basically dismantled a huge piece of the administration's trade policy. And what were the two words? Regulate and importation. That's it. And as the court saw it, there was just no way those two little words could bear the immense weight of a multi-billion-dollar global tariff regime. And believe me, the stakes were absolutely enormous. With this one ruling, up to $175 billion, that's billion with a B, in tariffs that had already been collected were suddenly declared illegal. I mean, this kicked off what one justice called a potential mess of refunds. So let's get to the core of it. What exactly happened here? Well, on February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court handed down this landmark ruling, and it sent a very, very clear message to the president. When it comes to imposing tariffs, you can't just use this particular law to go it alone. This single decision effectively dismantled a massive tariff structure. And this structure was built on two different national emergencies. One of them targeted drug trafficking from neighbors like China, Canada, and Mexico. The other one was aimed at correcting trade deficits with, well, pretty much everyone, including our allies in the European Union. And in one fell swoop, poof, the entire legal foundation for all of it was just gone. To really get the significance of this, we've got to look at the constitutional showdown that was really at the heart of it all. See, this wasn't just about trade policy. This was a classic Washington power struggle. We're talking the White House versus Congress. The administration's entire legal case was propped up by this 1977 law, the IEEPA. Now, this law was originally designed to give the president tools like sanctions or freezing assets during a real crisis. You can think of it like an emergency economic toolkit. But what it had never been used for in its entire history was setting broad, sweeping tax policy in the form of tariffs. And what's so fascinating here is how clearly this whole thing frames the fight. On one side, the administration was arguing that the power to regulate imports was a really broad authority that should naturally include tariffs. But on the other side, the businesses and states challenging them went straight for the Constitution, saying, wait a minute, tariffs are taxes. And the power to tax, what's known as the power of the purse, that belongs to Congress and Congress alone. So with these two really powerful arguments clashing, how did the court end up landing? Well, let's break down the decisive 6-3 majority decision. The vote itself really tells you a lot. A 6-3 majority, that's not some razor-thin margin, It's a really decisive statement from the court. It shows there was a pretty solid consensus on this very specific issue of presidential power. The majority's reasoning really stood on four powerful pillars. First, the simple fact, tariffs are taxes, and the Constitution gives that power to Congress. Second, the court basically said that if Congress was going to hand over such a massive power, it needed to use crystal clear language, and the word regulate just wasn't it. Third, they brought in something called the major questions doctrine. This basically says that for an issue with such huge economic and political consequences, the president can't just rely on a vague interpretation of an old law. And finally, there was history. In the 50 years IEEPA has been on the books, no other president had ever even tried to use it like this. But the dissent saw it completely differently. In this really sharp quote, Justice Kavanaugh argued that, look, the president already has the greater power to block imports entirely under IEEPA, so why shouldn't he be able to use the lesser power of a tax? Essentially, his argument was that the president had the right idea, he just used the wrong law to do it. But just when everyone was trying to process the end of the IEEPA tariffs, this is where the story takes a really sharp turn. The administration, while they weren't about to give up on their policy. So let's just be crystal clear about what this meant in that moment. The legal justification for years of tariffs on goods from huge partners like China, Canada, Mexico, the EU, it was gone. Invalidated. Over. And this just perfectly illustrates the administration's response. I mean, within hours of the Supreme Court decision, the president was already announcing a whole new set of tariffs. It was a clear signal that, okay, the tool has changed, but the protectionist policy has not. So, the president immediately reached for a different tool in the legal toolbox, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, this law allowed for a new 10% global tariff, but, and this is a big but, it came with some major catches. For one, it's meant to address a balance of payments deficit, which is basically when a country's spending more on foreign goods than it's earning. And critically, it's a short-term fix. It's capped at just 150 days. So, with one big door slammed shut and another smaller one pried open, what does the future of U.S. trade policy actually look like now? Because the fallout from this decision is really just beginning to unfold. So, here's why this all matters. First, you've got this massive multi-billion-dollar refund process that's probably going to be tied up in courts for years. Second, major trade deals that were negotiated with countries like India and Japan, deals that were built on the threat of these now illegal tariffs, are suddenly on really shaky ground. And all of this is ushering in an era of what experts are now calling patchwork protectionism. And this table does a great job of visualizing that new reality. That one big hammer of IEEPA, it's gone, and it's been replaced by this collection of smaller, more specialized tools. You've got Section 232 for national security tariffs on things like steel and aluminum. You've got Section 301 to target what are seen as unfair trade practices, especially from China. And now you've got this temporary Section 122 for more global issues. The thing is, each one comes with its own set of rules, its own limits, and its own procedural hoops, which makes trade policy a whole lot more complex. So all of this leaves us with a final and pretty provocative thought. I mean, there's no question the Supreme Court has checked presidential power here and reasserted Congress's authority over trade. But with the administration's immediate pivot to new tariff authorities, it's also pretty clear they still intend to play the game, just with a different set of rules. So the strategy has shifted, but the trade wars, they're far from over.
The era of emergency tariff power may be over, but the battle over who controls America's economy is far from finished. Headlines move fast. Power moves quietly. Subscribe to Tax Mystery to stay ahead of the system behind the story.